naszych gości z Królestwa Niderlandów, na czele z panem ministrem, panem ambasadorem, a także wszystkich przedstawicieli Holandii. Serdecznie witamy. Chciałem równie serdecznie przywitać współorganizatorów dzisiejszego wydarzenia, czyli Ministerstwo Spraw Zagranicznych, na czele z sekretarzem stanu panem ministrem Szymańskim. I oczywiście szczególnie serdecznie witamy naszego prelegenta dzisiejszego, pana profesora Ryszarda Lekutko. Aby nie przedłużać, a również nie pominąć kogoś z osób, które przyjęły to zaproszenie, bardzo serdecznie w Krajowej Szkole witamy wszystkich, którzy dzisiaj przybyli, są tu na sali, jak również osoby, które korzystając z internetowej transmisji przysłuchują się naszemu wydarzeniu. Proszę Państwa, jeśli chodzi o integrację europejską, wiemy o tym, że nie jest ona jakimś stanem rzeczy, tylko procesem. W związku z tym pojawiają się w tym procesie bardzo różne wyzwania, tak, do pokonania, czy też po to, żeby ten proces mógł się dalej rozwijać i wzmacniać. Warto pamiętać o tym, że jest to proces nie tylko polityczny, nie tylko proces gospodarczy czy społeczny, ale jest to też proces oparty na wspólnych wartościach, które powinny jednoczyć i łączyć cały nasz europejski kontynent. I powiem, że jest mi szczególnie miło i już może na początku słowo podziękowania skierowane do Ministerstwa Spraw Zagranicznych na ręce pana ministra, że to wydarzenie i ten wykład ma miejsce w Krajowej Szkole Administracji Publicznej i że mogą w nim uczestniczyć, przysłuchiwać się przyszli, którzy za kilkanaście lat będą również współtworzyć politykę europejską i właśnie te procesy integracyjne, a którzy obecnie są słuchaczami Krajowej Szkoły Administracji Publicznej czy też Akademii Dyplomatycznej MSZ. To tym bardziej nas cieszy. Bardzo dziękujemy. Aby nie przedłużać tej części oficjalnej, chciałem teraz poprosić o zabranie głosu współgospodarza pana ministra Konrada Szymańskiego. Panie ministrze.
Panie i Panowie, jest mi faktycznie niezmiernie miło reprezentować partnerem do przedsięwzięcia, kolejnej edycji tego przedsięwzięcia, Ministerstwo Spraw Zagranicznych. To bardzo dobry moment, bardzo dobry pomysł, by rozmawiać na temat najbardziej fundamentalnych aspektów przyszłości Europy, ponieważ myślę, że dziś już chyba wszyscy mamy świadomość, że moment historyczny, w którym Unia Europejska się znalazła, jest momentem krytycznym, jest momentem z całą pewnością bardzo ważnym. Bez względu na to, jak chętnie podejmujemy ton kryzysowy, czasami katastroficzny, myślę, że ten katastroficzny wciąż jeszcze nie jest uzasadniony, ale bez względu na to, jak chętnie przyjmujemy język historycznego przełomu, też historycznego kryzysu, to możemy się zgodzić, że Unia Europejska jest w bardzo trudnym położeniu. Ta inicjatywa, która od 8 lat ma miejsce w formacie, w ramach dwustronnych relacji będzie wspólny dla Polski i dla Holandii przyszłości. Obok konferencji utrechtskiej, która ma dużo dłuższą tradycję, to jest jedna z głównych regularnych, corocznych imprez polsko-holenderskich. Jest mi niezwykle miło też odnotować, że przy tej okazji, jak zawsze, mieliśmy możliwość z Thyssen van der Plassen odbyć bardzo długie, bardzo szczegółowe, detaliczne miejscami konsultacje na temat najważniejszych aspektów tego, co przed nami stoi na forum unijnym, na temat Brexitu, wieloletnich ram finansowych, przyszłości strefy euro, w końcu przyszłości samej Unii. Z całą pewnością niektóre z tych rzeczy, myślę, że tylko niektóre z tych rzeczy będziemy mogli przedstawić w ramach tego panelu. Ale biorąc pod uwagę nadzwyczajny czas, w którym się znaleźliśmy, na pewno jest to dobry moment, żeby zadawać sobie również pytania dużo głębsze. I szczerze mówiąc, tego spodziewam się, nigdy pod tym względem się nie zawiodłem. Tego spodziewam się po wystąpieniu profesora Ryszarda Lebutu. Czasy przestały być konwencjonalne. Nasze konwencjonalne prawdy, nasze konwencjonalne reakcje na różne wydarzenia przestają nieść ze sobą użyteczność. Dlatego warto pobudzić krytyczną refleksję, warto pobudzić najbardziej podstawowe pytania o to, po co jest Europa, po co jest Unia Europejska. Warto wrócić do najbardziej podstawowych dyskusji, debat, po to, żeby na nowo odpowiedzieć na te pytania. Na nowo, to znaczy w taki sposób, który będzie atrakcyjny dla współczesnego odbiorcy. Ponieważ dzisiaj chyba wiemy wszyscy wspólnie, być może z różnymi motywacjami, że stare odpowiedzi przestały się sprawdzać. Potrzebne są nowe odpowiedzi. Żeby udzielić nowych odpowiedzi, potrzebne jest mocne postawienie bardzo poważnych pytań, czego spodziewam się po wykładzie profesora Ryszarda Lebutko, który z przyjemnością mogę w ten sposób przed Państwem zapowiedzieć.
Dziękuję bardzo, panie ministrze. Chciałem jeszcze poprosić o słowo wprowadzenia naszego gościa, pana ministra van der Plassen. Mr. Minister, floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Rector. It is a great pleasure for me to be here today at the Polish National School for Public Administration. I have worked myself for 26 years in the government, in public service, and my father was a civil servant, and my grandfathers were both civil servants, and I hope my children will be as well, because being a civil servant is the most fantastic job there is. I went to law school and all my friends became bankers and lawyers, and whenever I discuss their work with them, I think I have more interesting work. They earn 5 times more than I do as a banker or a lawyer, but I still find that they have the most interesting job and the most honorable job, because working for your government, what is better than that? So it's great to see hopefuls here who will graduate from this school and then will serve the Polish government. It's also a great honor to meet today with Minister Szymański, who I consider a friend, and he mentioned all the topics we discussed. The European Union has a very heavy agenda, so we have our work cut out for us. Every time I am in Poland, I feel that I'm among friends, because that is what Poland and the Netherlands are. We're nations that are friends. We're very like-minded on many issues in the European Union. Next year we will celebrate 100 years of diplomatic relations between our two nations. And one thing that in the Netherlands we will never forget is the role that Polish soldiers played in liberating our country in 1944. I myself, I grew up in the town of Breda, and Breda is a town that was liberated by Polish soldiers. communist regime in Poland, so he fled to England, and he lived in England. And at a certain point, the citizens of my hometown found out that he was living there in poverty. He didn't have an easy life in the UK. So they wrote a letter to General Marchek, and they said, "General, why don't you come and live in Breda? We'll provide you with a house and with everything you need. You are a citizen of our town." And he politely replied, and he said, "Well, that is very nice, and thank you for the offer, but I've just gotten used to the bad weather here in the UK, so I think I'll stay." So he stayed, and he lived to be over 100 years old. And when he died, his remains were brought to my hometown, and he is buried in the Polish military cemetery. And I have visited that place many times. Today is the 8th lecture, the 8th Garamek lectures. I attended 4 of them personally. And Professor Garamek, of course, helped change the destiny of Poland. But he is bigger than just a national politician, because he was an outstanding thinker at a European level, a source of inspiration for many Europeans. And I warmly welcome the decision to have Professor Legutko deliver the lecture this year, because he has something in common with Professor Garamek, because they both combine philosophy and politics, both active politicians who are at the same time philosophers, and that makes for a very interesting combination. I am thrilled by the title of today's lecture, The Splendours and Glooms of European Integration. If you ask any person in the Netherlands, they will say that the splendors of European integration by far outweigh the glooms, because it is European integration that made Europe into a peaceful, prosperous, and safe continent. We couldn't imagine our continent without that European integration. So certainly there are glooms, but they are far outweighed by the splendors. I'm excited to listen to what Professor Legutko will share with us, and therefore I will stop talking here. Thank you very much.
Proszę Państwa, nie chcąc już zabierać czasu, ale jednak w kilku słowach przedstawiając naszego prelegenta, dzisiejszego wykładowcę, pana profesora Ryszarda Legutko, trzeba powiedzieć, że jest, tak jak powiedział pan minister, filozofem i politykiem, profesorem filozofii, znawcą Platona, a więc właśnie tych filozoficznych podstaw całego kontynentu, ale też człowiekiem z bogatym doświadczeniem publicznym, bo to nie tylko obecne członkostwo w Parlamencie Europejskim, ale również pamiętajmy, że pan profesor Legutko był senatorem Rzeczpospolitej Polskiej, był ministrem edukacji narodowej, a więc może patrzeć na procesy związane z integracją europejską również z ogromnym doświadczeniem praktycznym tego, jak funkcjonuje, jak powinno funkcjonować państwo. Panie profesorze, zapraszamy.
Just let me consult my watch. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. First, let me start by expressing my thanks. I have to say that I'm very gratified and privileged. I feel very privileged to be here, to have been invited to deliver this lecture. As it was already said, I'm wearing 2 hats. That of a politician and that of a philosopher. And The title of my talk, I think, somehow reflects these two roads I've been following during the last decades. So what you will hear will be both a mixed perspective of a practitioner and a theorist. Of course, theorists and philosophers in particular tend to be gloomers, but I'm trying to resist this temptation, and politics holds me in check. So without further ado, let me pass on to what I have prepared for this occasion. The truth is that most of us have taken the concept of integration for granted, which is best captured by such phrases as more Europe or the ever closer union, so often used in today's political rhetoric. But it should not be taken for granted. Let us point out that this concept gives the EU another dimension, which one might call, using a philosophical jargon, teleological. And this is remarkable in itself. The EU is an institution that has been defined not only by the treaties and the institutional framework which those treaties established, but also by the telos to be achieved in the future. This telos is a unity of European structures and European peoples. How this would look like in detail, nobody knows. But this telos is a crucial factor in understanding the EU politics, as well as, so to say, the EU mind. The factor is crucial because it makes the EU conspicuously different from its member states. None of the member states defines itself either in the constitution or in an openly declared strategy or in an officially accepted ideology by what it is going to achieve in the future. Let us start with what the founding fathers of integration had to say about the future of European project. This may be summarized in 3 points. Point number 1. The nations are basic collective identities and will not disappear. De Gasperi said, quote, "The basis of any European cooperation is a nation united with others in free community," unquote. Robert Schuman was even more explicit. "Our European countries are historical reality. From the psychological point of view, it would be impossible and unreasonable to eliminate them. Their diversity is a good thing, and it makes no sense to remove them, to level them, or to unify them," unquote. Upon this view, the construction of the superstate was impossible and unacceptable, which was said explicitly by Robert Schuman. Another quotation, "One cannot apply the term democracy to a regime which refused to accept the existence of a nation that is a community that has its own authentic heritage, having its own aspirations and missions, which it wants to pursue in total freedom," end of quote. So to sum up, what they said is that whatever form the integration will take, Germany, France, the Netherlands, other countries and nations will continue to exist. Point number 2. The integration was to be carried out by transferring power from the nation states to the supranational institutions. Even de Gasperi, who was rhetorically more self-restrained than others, and who said that the supranational institutions should have only as much power as it is really needed, or to be precise, as he put it, indispensable, not only emphasized the crucial role of such institutions in the integrating process, but also occasionally indicated, as the model to be followed, the American federalist system, with many states but having strong federal structure. The fragmentation of Europe was for him, as he said it, an absurd anachronism. Point number 3. In talking about the European Union, the founding fathers attributed the fundamental role of Christianity as the only source from which such a unity could be derived. The nature of the unity was spiritual, and the founding fathers were forthright about it. They explicitly talked about, quote-unquote, spiritual unity of Europe, or, in another place, the cultural community in the highest sense of the word. Robert Schumann, quote, I will never cease to repeat the unity of Europe will become a fact not solely and not primarily through the European institutions. The road to unity will be preferred in the spiritual realm, unquote. And this spiritual realm, this cultural community in the highest sense of the word, this spiritual unity was for them Christianity. Not only because it was the only unity that existed, not only because of its historical role as a unifying force, the only unifying force since the collapse of Romanitas, but also because Christianity was a moral force without which civic, political, ethical virtues would not develop and be inculcated, and because only Christianity could generate a sense of solidarity and a culture of civility that would be necessary for the integration to subsist. Let me quote Schumann again. Democracy owes its survival to Christianity. It came into being the day man was called upon to implement in his earthly life the principle of brotherly love towards every being. Before Christ, no one formulated such an idea. Hence, democracy is integrated with Christianity, both doctrinally and chronologically. I agree with Bergson when he said that democracy is by nature consonant with the gospel, because its moving spirit is love. Democracy must be Christian or it will not exist. An anti-Christian democracy would be a caricature sliding into tyranny or anarchy. End of quote. And again, a short excerpt from Konrad Adenauer. If we manage to go back to the roots of our European culture, which have grown out of Christianity, we will certainly succeed in creating the unity again in all areas of life in Europe. Unquote. So these are these 3 major statements. The question is, are they consistent? In a way they are. If we assume that the nations will be with us forever, that they freely decide to build supranational institutions modeled on democracy permeated by love, which will not replace but supplement the national identities and the identities within the nation states, that the European peoples achieve a certain type of spiritual, cultural renaissance, mainly through Christianity, then of course the entire construction is harmonious. Especially that this harmonization was hoped to happen in the course of time. It was the future that was to bring us the blessings of the integration and smooth the way by eliminating the obstacles, mainly through the spiritual and moral improvement. But once we pin down these statements and start dissecting them, we discover a lot of loopholes. Brotherly cooperation sounds fine, but politics, and this we have known from time immemorial, has never been brotherly, because politics is about power and about interests, or in less straightforward terms, about leadership. To be sure, there can be a cooperation between a strong partner and a weak partner, but let us make no mistake, the asymmetries in terms of political power between the states have always existed and will always exist. They may stay latent until the divergent interests reach a conflicting phase. But the more serious the conflict, the more this asymmetry comes to the fore. And this is the problem the founding fathers somehow neglected or even invalidated, having a strong faith in the spiritual renaissance of Europe. They also believe that democracy is a kind of the institutionalization, can't pronounce it now, but you know what I mean, of Christian love. While a belief in the spiritual renaissance of Europe had some grounds at that time, to the extent that such predictions can have rational grounding, and despite the fact that the subsequent growth of the European civilization failed to corroborate it, the view that democracy is based on love was simply mistaken, then, now, and anytime. It would be more appropriate to say that democracy is about channeling and disarming hate and hostility. Democracy is about how to gain power and to transfer power through elections and representations. There is no love in democracy, but intense hostility, which is somehow held in check, unfortunately not always, thanks to the rules and procedures of the orderly transfer of power. The language which the Founding Fathers used was often a high language, a lofty discourse of the visionaries, of moralists, not that of the politicians and political strategies. This did not prevent them from being efficient and practical in making the first steps towards cooperation in economy, resulting in the Treaty of Paris in 1951 and then the Treaties of Rome in 1957, founding the European Economic Community. But about the final outcome, they remain obscurely general and never seriously addressed a problem of a possible clash between the supranational institutions and the nation states. Neither did they envisage a possibility that a large part of Europe will openly reject Christianity and become anti-Christian. But their discourse of integration, sometimes naive, stemmed from a strong hope in the European spirit at the time when such hope was not widespread, often giving way to a daunting conviction of the spiritual crisis. The high language they used epitomized the intellectual and moral audacity which was needed to overcome the atmosphere of despair. Let it be reminded that the alternative to this atmosphere of despair at that time was communism, which after World War II seemed to be on the march to victory in some countries in Western Europe. The Founding Fathers' call for integration was a call for the resurrection of the most valuable European tradition, which was shaken by German National Socialism, and after its defeat was jeopardized by the advent of Marxism and Bolshevism. The period between the Treaties of Rome and the Treaty of Maastricht establishing the European Union was relatively long, 36 years. By that time, the Founding Fathers were no longer with us, and European culture radically changed. The 1968 revolution transformed the European elites, universities, and consequently political institutions. And it changed the language. The high language of the Founding Fathers disappeared, as did the politicians who could use such a language. The European politics made a tremendous shift to the left, the result of which was a general acceptance of what has always been typical of the political left, namely extensive and reckless social engineering. If the Founding Fathers look back at the European heritage to find fecund roots for the spiritual renewal of the modern world, the 68 and post-68 generations look at the European history as a long process of discrimination, exploitation, class struggle, sex struggle, racism, colonialism, Eurocentrism, logocentrism, phallocentrism, and so on and so forth. The concept of European integration could not but reflect this change. Tout commence en mystique et finit en politique. This is a well-known aphorism by Charles Péguy. Everything starts as a mystique and ends as politics. Yes, European integration started as a mystique, to which the high language of the Founding Fathers testifies. But since that time, we have been observing the implacable onslaught of politics. The creation of the EU generated a lot of practical problems, some of them technical, some of them strategic. The more members, the bigger the organization, the more problems, the more formidable the difficulties. One of the most acute and least solvable problems that the EU has faced is a hierarchy of power, political, economic, cultural, among the member states that are said and officially declared to be equal. But we know they are not equal, because the differences in power are objective and cannot be undone by decrees. Germany has more power than Poland. Poland has more power than some other countries. And this is something that will not disappear, and neither the supranational institutions nor spiritual unity, Christian or non-Christian, can change it. The actual hierarchy of power is fairly stable and cannot be undermined by democratic elections. No democratic political process can make any East European country as influential as Germany or France, at least not in the foreseeable future, because no democratic political process elevated those two countries to the position that they now have. This in itself creates a major confusion in the EU, making a serious discussion of its problems difficult. Why? Because there are two intermingled systems of power within the European Union. There is an official layer described and codified in the treaties where equality is guaranteed, but there is also an informal layer, not described anywhere, which is related to the real power structure. The combination of these two layers, official and non-official, decreed and non-decreed, makes the decision-making process systemically unclear. Consequently, the process of integration is also based on the decision-making mechanism that lack transparency. The authorship and the execution of the More Europe project are not easy to identify. The big players are at least as instrumental in pushing it forward as the European institutions, which would have been powerless without those players. It is therefore not surprising that the European institutions are more than charitable towards the big players and, when it is expected of them, roar like lions at smaller countries. None of the small countries would have gotten away with Nord Stream enterprise, which Germany has launched and has remained serenely unperturbed despite the general criticism of practically everybody. None of them would have gotten away with the persistent budget deficit, which France continued to have for several years, unscathed and undisturbed by the institutional guardians of European law. What is remarkable, however, is that despite this confusion and despite the chronic lack of transparency, the creed of unity has not been dropped. On the contrary, the cry for more Europe is as loud as ever among the European elites. More Europe meaning more integration, that is more federalism, more centralism, more power to the supranational institutions, together with the non-transparent power structures and their dependence on the big players. The bright future of the ever closer union has become an act of faith. We, the Europeans, are obliged to declare periodically, but the more often the better, that we believe in this future and that we are committed to make it happen. The presidents and the prime ministers visiting the European Parliament regularly profess this act of faith. And what they say and how they say it looks indeed like a religious ritual. Not saying what is expected or expressing reservations or doubts can be compared to a sin. The conflict between the Europeans, who should be called Euro enthusiasts, and the Eurosceptics, recently called populists, is said to be the basic conflict on which the future of the EU depends. I use the word religious deliberately because there is a clear element of surrogate religiousness in it. It's a negative qualification today. And this is most surprising. What is a skeptic? The simplest definition is that it is a person who has doubts, also in the matters that everybody regards as self-evident and unquestionable. In today's Western culture, being skeptical is a rather positive qualification. Everybody wants to be a skeptic. Modern man characterizes himself as someone who has doubts, who does not take anything for granted, who asks difficult questions. If so, then the modern man should be also a Eurosceptic. Or Euroscepticism should be consonant with the mindset of the modern man. And yet this is not the case. Euroscepticism is an exception. It is a skepticism that is disallowed. This act of faith seemed to be in conflict with other tenets of modernity, or rather with the tenets that seem to represent modernity. For instance, we have been told 1,000 times that the age of big projects and big narratives is over, and that the modern man no longer believes in such projects because he perceives the world as discontinuous. Now, how can he believe in the ever closer union if at the same time he is said to assume that the world is discontinuous? Or another point that has been often repeated. History is an open-ended process, and whoever treats it as aiming at a definite collective goal is a dangerous person because he closes what should be open. Future has many surprises, the argument runs, and so many parameters that cannot be properly identified today, that projecting today's big narratives into the times to come is a doubtful and risky procedure. This argument is a canonical tenet of the modern thinking, and yet it does not undermine an almost messianic belief in the ever closer union. One could thus say that the concept of the ever closer union contradicts the dominant philosophy of modern times, and that therefore there seems to be a tension between modernity and postmodernity on the one hand and the idea of continuing integration on the other. The question is, whence this loudly declared creed of European unity, when the belief in unity as such, any unity, seems to be clearly on the way in the entire Western world? My answer is because it is a useful political instrument. For one thing, there is nothing in today's discourse about Europe that would even remotely resemble the high language of the Founding Fathers. Today's unity is a political and ideological project that has nothing cultural in it, and certainly nothing of what the Founding Fathers were writing about: spiritual unity, the cultural unity in the highest sense of the word, and so on. There is no sense of history in today's European discourse, nor any serious allegiance to the European heritage. Whoever looks for a proof, let him visit the House of European History, which is a perfect illustration of the modern European mind. Ideologically, the EU is in the hands of socialists and liberals. The Christian Democrats, who should have, as the descendants of the Founding Fathers, continue their historical, cultural and spiritual message of Europe, have marginalized themselves in that respect. So, answering the question about the idea of the European unity, the Christian Democrats are repeating the ideological agenda of the socialists and liberals without contributing anything substantial themselves to the basket of ideas. Although the proposal to build the House of European History came from one of the Christian Democrats, you would look in vain for any mark of the Godfather in the museum. One cannot but confirm yet again a sad fact that European Christian democracy has been unable or unwilling to leave an imprint on the EU's interpretation of European history. So why is the concept of the ever closer union a useful political instrument? Because, among other things, because it allows to ignore or to bypass the existing legal and political constraints and limitations. In fact, the more we declare our support of the ever closer union, the less we feel bound by those constraints and limitations, and the more we are tempted to proceed by the method of a fait accompli. A fait accompli is always a step forward, a step towards the ever closer union. And therefore, whatever the step is, it cannot be bad, nor can it be undone. The whole debate about integration and its limits has little sense if we believe in the unstoppable process of integration. The question whether changes into when, not about whether to integrate this or that, but when to do it. Such a debate is spurious because the substantive counter-arguments about whether this or that should be done are usually brushed aside as illegitimate and possibly populist. Take the question of the monetary union. There cannot be any debate on whether this union is a good thing and whether it should be weakened in some way under the pressure of experience, because anyone who has doubts about it commits a sin of disbelief. The only question is when, and the only answer is the sooner the better. This in turn allows to evade one of the fundamental principles of the EU, the principles of conferral, which states in the Article 5 of the Treaty on the EU that, quote, the Union shall act only within the limits of the competences conferred upon it by the Member States. Competences not conferred upon the Union in the treaties remain with the Member States, unquote. Let us take as an example the notorious rule of law framework proposed by the former Commissioner Viviane Reding. Immediately after the proposal was formulated, it was mercilessly criticized by the legal services of the European Council as incompatible with the principle of conferral. The Member States did not confer on the Commission the competence to be the prosecutor and the judge of the legal system. To put it more forcefully, the rule of law framework was itself at odds with the rule of law. There is another argument to it. The European Commission, being an executive body, cannot dictate the solutions to the legislative and judiciary institutions of the Member States. Moreover, the Commission cannot present itself as the defender of the separation of powers, because in interfering with those institutions, the Commission negates the very principle of the separation of powers. And yet this is precisely what the Commission has been doing. No wonder that the trenchant legal arguments against these practices were ignored and the framework was accepted as a politically useful device. However, primarily it was accepted because it marked, no matter that through a most dubious procedure, another step in the process of integration, another step towards more Europe. Giving it up, and this would be warranted both by prudence and by legal judgment, would mean going back or losing an opportunity for a new fait accompli. Or let us take another example, the Brexit. The decision of the British people to leave the EU was also a reaction against the more Europe policy, especially that in other countries the rhetoric of exits, though less salient, could also be heard. Sometimes it was the rhetoric of partial exits, such as leaving the monetary union. The Brexit dealt a serious blow to the concept of relentlessly progressive integration. This obvious conclusion, the obvious conclusion to be drawn from the Brexit should have been a reconsideration of this policy. Going forward from the lower level to the higher level of integration makes sense only when the lower level functions well. If it does not, going forward to the higher level becomes extremely risky. And yet this is what was advised after the Brexit. Chancellor Merkel said, let me quote her, after the British referendum on the EU, we need a big step forward in the European integration, unquote. Or Jean-Claude Juncker, the proper response to the crisis should be a deeper integration, quote, unquote. This amounts to something like this. The medicine prescribed by the doctor produced bad side effects. In order to eliminate those bad side effects, the doctor suggested that the patient should increase the dosage. This is well illustrated by a saying we all know, a saying that for many years has been circulating in Europe, namely that integration is like riding a bicycle. We have to continue pedaling or else we fall down. I always found this saying rather bizarre because it expresses, contrary to the intentions of those who believed in its wisdom, a lack of confidence in the integrated European community of nations. Those people apparently assume that once we stop integrating, we will begin to disintegrate. Or to put it differently, that the existing supranational institutions in the current shape will not survive by themselves, that the EU of today is built on sand and any serious shock may put an end to an inherently unstable unity. This is a most pessimistic assessment, of the existing European institutions, the paradox being that this pessimism comes from the Euro enthusiasts. Although this pessimistic view has not been stated explicitly, it is clearly there, implicit but legible. And it is more than pessimism. In statements like this, one can also sense fear. The reaction to the Brexit of the EU leaders was meaningful. What they said amounted to this: to avoid more exits, instead of eliminating the causes that generated the Brexit, we have to make potential future exits more difficult. The bicycle metaphor sounded this time more like a threat, which was all the more disconcerting. To conclude, I have argued that the teleological dimension of integration was more appropriate for the mystique stage of European integration and much less appropriate to the stage of politics, to refer to Charles Péguy's aphorism again. In the world of omnipresent and all-intrusive politics in which we live, this teleology has unpleasant consequences. It bedims the picture of the power structure within the European institutions, limits the scope of a debate, and ultimately inhibits possible reforms, because it imposes on the European mind the view that integration is a one-way street. But there is no one-way street politics in any member state, in fact in any country, because politics as such is about pursuing alternative paths and choosing diverse solutions. Why should it be different in the EU? In the past, the teleological dimension of the in the Founding Fathers expressed the audacity of the European mystique. In today's world of politics, this dimension is a combination of power play and ideological dogmatism, rather than a mobilizing force for European nations or a self-assertion of the European spirit. Thank you.
Dziękujemy bardzo, panie profesorze. Ja w żaden sposób nie czuję się kompetentny do tego, żeby podsumowywać to wystąpienie, szczególnie, że wykład pana profesora miał wiele wątków, bo słyszeliśmy i odwołania bardzo aktualne i konkretne, dotyczące chociażby Brexitu. Słyszeliśmy też o problemach typowo prawniczych, o artykule 5 Traktatu o Unii Europejskiej, ale także i co najważniejsze chyba słyszeliśmy ważne słowa o źródłach Unii, integracji, o myśli ojców założycieli, o znaczeniu tego wspólnego dziedzictwa, które powinno łączyć, które powinno rzeczywiście być podstawą tej wspólnoty europejskiej. Proszę Państwa, mam za to nadzieję, że te wątki zarysowane, te problemy przedstawione przez pana profesora znajdą swój dalszy ciąg też i być może już bardziej polityczne. Pan profesor też mówił właśnie o tym, o tej roli polityków, jest to zrozumiałe w dalszej części dzisiejszego popołudnia w debacie, ponieważ ten wykład jest częścią wzajemnych relacji polsko-holenderskich i w związku z tym mamy też szczególną okazję, ażeby posłuchać o perspektywie obu krajów, o perspektywie integracji na dzień dzisiejszy, rok przed kolejnymi wyborami do Parlamentu Europejskiego, jak również właśnie w dziejącym się na naszych oczach procesie Brexitu. Do tej dyskusji serdecznie zapraszam panów ministrów, pana Van der Plasa i pana Szymańskiego. Natomiast o jej poprowadzenie chciałem poprosić pana dyrektora Sławomira Dębskiego, szefa Polskiego Instytutu Spraw Międzynarodowych. Zapraszam.
What starts as a mystic ends as a politics. From this quote, I was borrowed from the lecture we have just heard. I would like to start our conversation because a mystical part of our meeting is already behind us. Now we are going to focus on political issues that drive process of European integration now. Before I ask you, gentlemen, question about these drivers of current European politics, let me share with you one very personal note, and with the audience, because people come and go here. Lectures given by different speakers, and only after some years realize that they really experienced something unique, something very special. I had the pleasure and honor to study at the Jagiellonian University, and Professor Ryszard Legutko was my philosophy teacher. And there is a definition of good university. Not formal one, of course. A good university, it is a school when you have half of your lectures you can hear without any significant takeout. But if you have only few excellent ones, that's a good university. So I have to tell you that Professor Ryszard Legutko was one of the most inspiring university teachers I have heard. So thank you very much, Professor, for your presentation, your lectures today, and you had a big deal of luck today. I'm addressing to the audience. Coming back to our problem. I do like to speak with Europe's ministers. They are very interesting creatures. They know Europe much more than we can even imagine. They know Europe from very bad side, I would say. They know Europe of conflict. They know Europe of different interests, colliding interests. Sometimes they know Europe of blackmail, political pressures, deals under the carpet, all this stuff. But after having this experience, they come out to the public and say, we all have a bright future. So that's the fascinating moment. Now I can address to you a question, having in mind what we have just heard from Professor Legutko. How we could now sell a good message about European integration to the general public. We are in the moment of deliberations. There are observers who say that the future of Europe would be coined between Paris and Berlin, and others necessary would follow, of course. There are those who say that actually Europe is already too big, and we have to focus our consideration on the question how to shrink it, how to make more efficient, one say, but in the end it means even closer. There's another term, but in real terms, smaller union. So how we could go to the public and say we need smaller union, and this smaller union would be much more effective than this big one we have experienced right now. So I probably ask this question to the representative Europe Minister of the Kingdom of Netherlands first.
Thank you. In answering your question, will you allow me also to react to some of the things that Professor Legutko said, because I found his lecture very interesting and also thought-provoking, and I want to come back to a couple of notions. The first one is the question, is the EU a Christian club, or is it not? And Professor Legutko made clear that for the founding fathers, the Gasperi, Monet, Schumann, they were very much inspired by the Christian ideal in shaping this union. You can read that from all their memoirs. So that is true. That is a historical truth. But does that make the European Union a Christian club? I don't think so. And I remember in the convention and later on in the IGC on the European Constitution, there was this big debate whether in the preamble of the European Constitution we should say that the heritage of Europe is Christian Judeo or Judeo-Christian. And every time the Polish Prime Minister in the European Council, when we were discussing the European Constitution, would raise his hand and say, I want a preamble that says that it's a Judeo-Christian heritage. And every time the Polish Prime Minister did that, my Prime Minister would raise his hand and say, and I support the Polish Prime Minister. Even though our advice to him was that he wouldn't support it, because I am convinced that that is not what is guiding us today. I am not a Christian. I have worked in European integration for 26 years. I have never noticed that my politicians were inspired by Christian ideals in shaping the monetary union or the migration policy or the foreign and security policy. So that's one thing I think we should not do, is advertise it as a Christian club. We have, in my country, close to 1 million Muslims. They wouldn't identify with this. Then another thing that Professor Legutko mentioned, and that is the concept of the ever closer union. And here I think my Prime Minister is very close to his thought, in that my Prime Minister several times in Parliament has already said, I hate that concept of an ever closer union. It is in the preamble of the treaty. When we shaped the Treaty of Lisbon, we were contemplating trying to get it out as the Netherlands, because we don't like the concept of an ever closer union. Besides, it's a misunderstood concept, because in the preamble it says an ever closer union between the citizens of Europe, which is something else than ever closer integration towards a federal superstate, because that's clearly not what we want. I think in order to make Europe more popular for the average citizens, we have to explain to them there are certain things that are inseparably bound to the member state. So Europe is not going to end up in a federal superstate. Ever closer union is not going to happen. Something else we can make, this is an issue that Professor Legutko also mentioned. He basically implied the rules don't apply to the bigger member states. France and Germany can do whatever they want and there will be no consequence. And we in the Netherlands have a national trauma from this, because in 2003 France and Germany violated the rules of the Stability and Growth Pact, and our then finance minister wanted them to be sanctioned for this, and there was a proposal by the Commission to do that. And France and Germany bullied quite a few other member states, and there was no majority to do that, so they got away with it. Until this day, our politicians still talk about that. Because that was clearly a case where all of a sudden the rules didn't apply to these two member states. But I venture to say that times have changed. Because we have seen, after France and Germany didn't respect the rules of the Stability other member states started disrespecting those rules, and the whole pact fell apart, and we ended up in the financial crisis of 2007. So I think we have learned from that experience, and that now we are in a situation where also big member states are bound by the rules. Let me see what else. Yeah, one thing, Professor Legutko in his speech seemed to juxtapose supranationalism versus the role of member states. And we feel in the Netherlands that those two things can go together. The European Union needs very strong member states. It all starts with the member states. If we have weak member states, we will have a weak union. So member states need to be strong, and they need to play a strong role. But at the same time, when you work together with 28 member states, you need certain rules. And everybody, even the strongest member states, should subject to those rules. And that's the rules of the community method. That is one, qualified majority voting. And yeah, you might sometimes end up on the losing side of such a vote. Poland has experienced that. We have experienced that. And that's really, yeah, you win a few, you lose a few. Sometimes you lose a qualified majority vote. But you nevertheless respect the results. Because the internal market would never have been built with unanimity. It needs qualified majority voting. So that's the first rule of the community method. The second rule is independent oversight by the Commission. Or we are also, I think like Poland, sometimes very critical of the supervisory role that the Commission plays, because the Commission has too many roles. So you might sometimes want to give supervision to an independent institution, but you need independent supervision. And three, you need an ultimate arbiter, which in the case of the community method is the European Court of Justice. Now that, yeah, oh, mic or closer, yeah, that's better. So you need those rules, and that means for member states to hand over sovereignty. You lose part of your sovereignty when you join the club. And politicians need to be honest about that. No credible politician can say, we're a member of the European Union, but we don't hand over sovereignty, because you do when you enter. It's the rules of the club. I think I will stop there in my reactions.
And now it's Konrad Szymański turn. What we can take out of the lecture of Professor Legutko and deliver to the public?
I think what is most relevant at this part of the discussion is the very clear message of Professor Legutko that integration needs a kind of universalism. Historically, and Professor Legutko rightly mentioned it, it was the only universalism we experienced deeply, which is Christianity in Europe. And of course, Thies is probably right that it is no more relevant for Europe. But it is a part of the problem, and it is not a part of the solution. Because every time we talk about integration, we make an impression that we are talking about something far more important than just the natural play of interest. That we are talking about the added value of integration, which is something per se in international relations. And it's probably true. But if it's true, it needs to be founded on a kind of universalism. And in place of Christianity, which is a still weaker and weaker experience of our nations, we probably could need something more, something different, but we haven't that. Another universalism around, which is, for example, the liberal democracy, is still very weak and undefined to be a parallel or equivalent foundation for such an ambitious project like the European integration. Anyway, in the end, in politics, we need a good reason to do something for someone else at the expense of your own political interests. You need a very long perspective and believe that it's worth doing, because this time I will help him, and in the end, then the general balance of our cooperation will be better. But to sell it you need a universal perception like this, something much more than contractual politics. And this is why the lack of universal experience in Europe is a part of the problem, not a solution. It's nothing good that it's probably true that Christian universalism is no more stable basis for the future of Europe. But in place of that, such a substantial aspect, we, as a European Union, we elaborated a more, I would say, operational concepts, like the bicycle metaphor. Probably the bicycle metaphor would be attractive for my Dutch colleague for a lot of reasons, but not in essence. Because if the bicycle metaphor is a popular understanding of ever closer union, which is a much more philosophical approach to the political concept, it is no more relevant to our political reality. And my Dutch colleague is the best person to acknowledge it, to explain why in such a long-lasting European member state, ever closer union is no more attractive a paradigm or selling instrument for European Union. To be honest, we as European Union's leaders, we admitted that fact, even formally, with a pre-Brexit deal in February 2016, when all leaders of the European Union, to make a good impression among the British people, we signed a pre-Brexit deal, not efficient, it's a great pity, but we accepted the fact that ever closer union doesn't mean what usually means. It means something different, maybe something about the people which should be closer to each other. No more the superstate. We acknowledged that fact politically, formally, so it is no more relevant. But before we go to this very big political question, how to sell Europe again, I think the most important thing is to put the right questions and to open the discussion without any kind of taboo. And here, I think the most striking thing from my perspective, I'm not liberal. Peace is not Christian. I'm not liberal. I wouldn't call myself liberal. But we have a lot of common things, and we can operate the union for the moment quite efficiently. Being not liberal, I would say that I'm really astonished by the fact that such a core liberal value, at least since the time of John Stuart Mill, like skepticism, is so unwelcomed in today's Europe. Professor Legutko mentioned about it a couple of passages. It is true that the skepticism is no more fashionable as we stop the war against the Ancien regime. It is quite useful for some time, but not relevant anymore. I think this is wrong, because the only thing we have on our hands today is the sound, noble skepticism, and ask ourselves what went wrong. I think in politics, it's good to ask ourselves what went wrong. Without a proper skepticism, I'm not talking about hostile, ungrounded, anti-European phobia. I'm talking about skepticism in this lexical and philosophical term. Without a proper skepticism, we can't put a right question, and we can't answer freely what we really mean by Europe. And without putting these taboos elaborated in 1990s aside, we can't offer our public the real, fresh, invigorating new answers for the question of Europe of tomorrow.
Saying and talking about skepticism, Professor Legutko was quite close, I believe, to the notion of heresy. I mean, today in our discussion about Europe, the old notion of heresy and the term heresy was consumed by the skepticism. So we are believers or disbelievers. in regards to European integration project. Why I used this this comparison between these two terms? Because we are sometimes being asked to believe that the solutions shaped, delivered, cooked in Brussels would produce only good results for all societies in Europe. Sometimes politicians make mistakes and then blame Brussels, saying that that's not we were right, that's not our mistake, that's Brussels, that's somewhere, you know, in the rooms of either Commission or the Council when the trouble was produced. And then we come to the majority voting. And through the majority voting, we share the consequences of bad decision made by a few politicians. And again, people are asked to believe that this solution is the best for all member states. That was the case of refugee/migration crisis, when decisions had been made by some European politicians, but the political consequence was tend to share with all societies by majority voting. Polish government, previous one and this one, had very little chance to gain public support for migration quotas domestically in Poland, but it was outvoted in the Brussels. How we could deal with this trouble of accountability in Europe, when sometimes you rightly mentioned that for the health of common market we have to agree on majority voting, but in all cases, in all issues, we should use this instrument. Migration trouble was not so much about internal market. It was different kind of issue. Should we believe that the European Union always produce a good outcome for all of us?
Do I believe that majority voting brings us further, also outside the internal market? Yes. I'm a total believer in majority voting. The one reason why the common security and defense policy of the EU is still in its infancy is because it's unanimity. Everything is unanimity. We could never adopt council conclusions that are meaningful on Israel and the Middle East peace process because it's unanimity and we have two camps. So I always say to my colleagues in the political side of the house, try QMV for CFSP. It worked for the internal market and it might also work for CFSP. So yes, I'm a believer. But I must say we have all done a lot of soul searching after we took a QMV decision that forced also countries that didn't want to accept refugees. And I know how painful this process of being outvoted was in the Visegrad countries. It was under the Luxembourg presidency at the time. We really thought it was a good idea. And now we're sometimes wondering, was that really a good idea? And I think the jury's still out. What I certainly did not like is the reaction of the countries that were outvoted. Because if you're outvoted, it's the rules of the game. So you should just accept it. But some of these countries, after the vote said, and we will not do it. We will disobey this regulation. And we will fight it in court. And even if we lose in court, we will still not do it. Nobody can ever force us to do this. Well, that's wrong. Because then you don't play by the rules of the game. If you don't like it, try to change the rules of the game. But once you're in the club, you need to stick to the rules. So I really hope, and there's a court case now at the ECJ about this, if the ECJ says, no, this was a valid decision, I just expect everybody to comply with it. Because if we start saying, here's a result that I don't like and therefore I will disobey it, that's the end of our project. So we can't have that. But that leaves unanswered the question, was it smart to outvote these countries when they were making it very clear to us, look, you're going against a vital interest of our nations, and it's really a decision that we cannot implement because our populations will simply not accept it, and that we still outvoted them. We took that decision at the height of the refugee crisis, and I'm not sure, to be honest. I am not sure. The jury is still out. And we haven't solved the issue, because now that was an emergency decision, but now we need to take decisions about our permanent migration model. And there again the question is, if tomorrow Italy is all of a sudden confronted with 500,000 refugees from Africa taking the boat, their beaches are flooded, 500,000, could happen, eh? Greece got 1 million in 2015. Suppose that happens. Are we going to say to the Italian government, those 500,000 are for you, and you solve it? Or are we going to say to the Italian government, that happened without any fault of your own, and we need to be in solidarity, so we will take some of these migrants from you. And that's the issue of solidarity. And we're still negotiating a compromise on the Dublin regulation, technical term. That was supposed to happen in June. I don't see it happening in June anymore, but we need to solve the issue. And the key word of the solution is solidarity.
Same question. How, Minister van der Plas said that if you don't like the rules, try to change them.
I think it's the easiest and probably the shortest way to make Europe even in the deeper crisis than it is today. Because the irrelevancy of some policies of the EU for some countries, every country has its own beauty in this set, is the problem. And we can, whatever we think about it, is it relevant or not relevant, proportional or unproportional, the political reality is like this. The efficiency of the decision-making process isn't the only evaluation criteria we should use. In the end, we have a political wisdom how to use the instruments we have on our hands. And efficiency is definitely not the only criteria. The quality of the process, the stability of the whole family is also a problem. And here we have a very good example, very toxic example, I think the academic example, how not to use the instruments we have in terms of responsibility for the future. Because the future of this family isn't very clear and isn't guaranteed for 100%. So we should abstain from the actions which would trigger even more negative emotions. In terms of selling Europe, it is a problem. I think we closed that problem for the moment, but we are closer to this path. In political marketing, it is one of the basic things not to promise too much, because if you promise too much, the disappointment is very close to you, and it is immediate reaction of the people. You can't cheating people frequently. You can do it once, but not frequently. And one of the problems of the EU today is the inheritance of the past, where Europe were so eager to say that yes, we will fix all the problems you have in the southern part of Eurozone, in the northern part of Eurozone, and unemployment, public debt. We have the very good recipe, the European semester, for example. We know how to do it. Here you have a list, the shopping list of very small things like the retirement reform or other public spending limitations. And yes, we will get economic synergy, convergence, and we will be safe. It didn't happen because of political circumstances. For Netherlands, probably the 2003 was one of the most dramatic experience with this, where the politics come back to the table and said technocrats that there are limits, But we have our own experience today with the migration policy. I think the political wisdom is much more important than technocratic, static approach to the instruments we already have in the treaties, and especially now in this crisis time, in instability time, we should be a little bit more sensitive over this.
Now I would like to change the sequence of responding to my question. So I would address this question to Konrad Szymański first. Another side of the coin is the question of institutions. Commission in the treaties has been defined as a guardian of the treaties. But sometimes one may have an impression that it is not only guardian of the treaties, but also the guardian of European integration project. So there are like a kind of the group of the only wise men in the room who have a magic power to control the older notion of integration, and sometimes use every opportunity to grab even more power from the member states. What should be the role of Commission in this future European integration project? How we could explain to our general public that the Commission is not the guardian of integration project, but only the guardian of the treaties. How we can achieve this result? Is it feasible, or the process already is out of the control, and the Commission would steer us in uncharted waters of European politics, not necessarily European integration politics?
If this treaty doesn't help to put European Commission into the limits of the competence divisions described in the treaty, nothing will help. Of course, I agree that the political reality is something different than the written treaties and the concepts behind the treaties, etc. But the European integration and European Union is not an exemption from the political world, where the competition of powers and competition of institutions is a natural everyday experience. Of course, there are many things very individual for the European integration. It is organization per se, I agree. It is, of course, international law organization, but with a quite dense legal acquis, with a quite dense cooperation mechanism, QMV inside in the subsidiary or secondary law. It is exceptional. But what is not exceptional is the fact that every institution would like to get more power over the rest. So without the proper response from the member states, which is the European Council mainly, and the activity, rising activity of the European Council is I think, very illustrative to the actual state of play with, in this power competition. Without the proper response, we can't expect that the European Commission will limit itself in this race. I think it's a natural reaction, I agree, but it is not necessarily good reaction for the European integration and the future, because too creative, too active role of European Commission or even the court. We have the problem of the court activism, especially in international court. The concept of the court activism was elaborated in the US, but the court activism or legal activism of the international courts is another problem. We have to live with this, and we have to respond to this properly. I think it will be not solved by any even better treaty than we have today.
So coming back, to you, sir, with the notion of new treaty, that was a mention. First, what are prospects of new treaties now? Can we really have it in foreseeable future? And the second, what should be a balance between the responsibilities for process of EU integration between EU Commission and the member states? Who should have this ring of power in this process?
Let me start with the question about the European Commission. And let me start, before I criticize them, to pay tribute to them. Because the European Commission is indispensable in our project. And the European Commission is an impressive administration with over 30,000 highly skilled civil servants, truly dedicated to the European integration project. So there's a lot of positive to say about the Commission. Can the Commission be better than it is right now? It certainly can. What would be needed for that? First of all talk about a political commission should stop. This is an invention of Mr. Juncker and Mr. Zellmeyer, a political commission. We're highly suspicious of that, because what does it mean? Whose politics? Left, right, center? No, the commission should not be political. The commission should be objective and neutral. And
bureaucratic.
And that is something else than political. Second, the Commission should stop saying that more integration is better, because that's not necessarily true. In some areas, yes. In other areas, no. And I must say, the Juncker Commission in that respect has made a lot of progress already compared to previous commissions, because they're a lot more serious about subsidiarity and about focusing on the important things than their predecessor. So that is good. We sometimes tend to think in the Netherlands that the Commission has too many roles, because they propose legislation. Then they are the guardian of the treaty and of the acquis communautaire, so they supervise the implementation of the legislation. Then in some areas, such as the Stability and Growth Pact, they also propose the sanctions. And also in the monetary union, they're also the fire brigade if everything goes wrong. Well, that is too many roles. And especially the supervision role of the Commission, we sometimes wonder, can we not put that role in the hands of a really independent institution? And especially if we hear President Juncker say that France should be treated differently because it's France, then the voices of our politicians to have an independent supervisor become even stronger and stronger. So that is something, if there ever were to be a treaty change, we would look at that issue, to separate certain roles. You can also do that within the Commission by putting Chinese walls, but you can also take some stuff out. Then your question was on, should there be treaty change? It is a mantra of the Netherlands to say no treaty change. We simply don't see why we need it. The current treaty was agreed not too long ago. The ratification procedures were painful. If we are going to have a new treaty, then we will negotiate for 2-3 years in the convention and in the IGC, and everything else will stop, and then the ratification will certainly go wrong in 1 or 2 member states, and then we need to fix that again. So we really don't see the imperative for treaty change at the moment.
Thijs, I think the answer for your question why we need the new treaty is very simple. You would have a chance to propose the QMV voting for the CFSP matters. It's the only way to do it. But I agree that the result of the Dutch referendum on any EU treaty is highly predictable.
That's right. But there is also...
But not in Poland. I think in Poland we are in a quite different situation, which is highly against the stereotypes we live in Brussels bubbles.
But there is another reasoning in favor of at least a consideration about the new treaty. I mean, President Macron's proposals for EU reforms, because at least some of them go far beyond the treaties we have now. So, how we should approach to such visions? Whether we are talking about some hidden, however, project of treaty change, or rather doing something outside of the treaties? And do we have to simply follow France and Germany, who are going to agree on something going far beyond of treaties we have?
I'm afraid the treaty President Macron is thinking about would be hard to defend even in Warsaw, but let's try. Let's try. Don't close the discussion before it starts. Of course, we don't want to make any taboo in European discussion. That's why we reacted for Brexit as a country, as a political party as well, with an obvious conclusion that we should talk about our future seriously, and without a major treaty change, which wouldn't create ambiguity, which created some misunderstanding between us and British people, it's hard to predict our future. It's a question of our responsibility. So don't make another taboo. The treaty change shouldn't be a taboo. Of course, we know where we are in terms of political process in Europe. It is true that we would be, as a political party, we would be ready to defend many versions of the new European treaty. Maybe not all of them, but it is still feasible in Poland. But we know where we are in some even funding member states where we can't defend any European treaty. And this is a good question, why? Why the whole situation is so bad that we can defend the European integration, at least in some countries, only with a negative message, that you know the alternative is hell. That was the message of some campaigners to stay in the UK, and it didn't help. I think the negative motivation in politics is the worst thing. You can do it time to time, but you have to create a good, positive reasons to do something. And the European Union is the same. We have to find a good, positive reasons why we are here. Talking to the people that you know, we are here because we have no alternative, it's bad, because people could start thinking that it's maybe there is alternative, maybe the hell is not so hot as they think. And we will have an example with British tough exercise that there is a world, there is a life after life, and of course maybe it's not fully comfortable, maybe we could choose differently in these circumstances, but this kind of narrative, the dramatic narrative, I think it's not relevant here. But I would like to come back to the issues central to Professor Legutko's intervention, lecture, because whatever we think about the vitality of the Christendom in Europe, anyway, we live in a political world which was formed by Christian political thought. I mean, great tradition. I'm not talking about last 100 years. I'm talking about more than 1,000 years. And it's a very good illustrative example how frequently we used even theological words to describe the political process. The heresy, the skepticism as a heresy is just one example. Even the EMU question, Thies said that EMU is a very good example to prove the thesis that we are far from this theological discussion. I think the EMU is a very good example that we are very close to old historical theological discussion which divided us, I mean North and the Roman world, about salvation by the grace or salvation by the deeds. And of course the North was pretty closer to the belief that it's impossible to save the people by the grace only, that the deeds are necessary. That's why you are so skeptical about governmental contract in Italy, which is deeply rooted in maybe a rotten version of the Roman Catholicism, where the debt relief is the first proposition by the grace of the rest of the system. But to be serious, I deeply believe that all our concepts and the way we understand the world is formed by Christendom. And that's why the missing universalism in our project is a real problem. And of course, we can tinker this machine together with Thies and others for many, many years. and this bicycle will not fall out. But will it be a really attractive bicycle? Will it be a very good bicycle? Everybody would like to have it and ride? I'm not sure. It's just the tinkering.
There is probably time for only one more question. So let me use this opportunity to ask the following one about Brexit. I've heard from some very experienced Dutch politicians a kind of the anecdote that before Brexit, United Kingdom played a role of a bad guy within EU. So had Dutch politicians have a problem with some European politics or proposals, they pick up the phone, call to London and ask to intervene on behalf of Netherlands. And English or Brits usually play this role. Now they are leaving. Who are going to play a role of a bad guy in the process of European integration? I mean, an actor who would say no to the dominant way of reasoning in the EU. Others would, of course, follow, but who would be the first one? I mean, Netherlands, Poland, the group of 8?
The decision is taken.
Interesting question, the way you put it. I think the silver lining of Brexit, because Brexit for us is horrible. For a country like the Netherlands, Brexit is an absolute nightmare in terms of the damage that it will do to our economy. We have very strong trading relations with the UK, very strong investment relations, and we will suffer. And my Prime Minister at least is honest about it. So he goes to the Parliament and says it's a lose-lose, we will suffer. Whereas British politicians go to their Parliament and say we have a glorious future, which is rubbish. They don't. Because their economy will suffer as well. It is already. They used to be the fastest grower and now they're the slowest grower in the European Union. But the silver lining for us is that it is enhancing our position of influence in the European Union, and not by playing the bad guy, because the UK was not a bad guy. They had a very much pro-trade agenda. They had a very much pro-transatlantic link agenda, a pro-internal market agenda, a pro-climate agenda. Those were all our agendas. Very like-minded country, and in many of those issues also like-minded to Poland. So Poland and the Netherlands are losing an ally, a friend. And apart from the economic damage, that in itself is tragic. But the Netherlands, of course, is in that group of like-minded countries that were close to the UK, and we're the next biggest economy. So people are now looking at us and say, like, the leadership role that was played before by the UK now has to be played by the Netherlands. And combined with the fact that my Prime Minister is in his 8th year in the European Council, so one of the old hands, that there is a shift in the power balance, and it is not necessarily to our disadvantage. But it also requires a different attitude from us in the Netherlands. Because if you don't have a leadership role, you can take extreme positions in the European Council. Say, I have my position, I'm not going to pay more than this, and I will just say no to anything else. If you have a leadership position, you have to help shape the compromise. And that means, at an early stage, leave your extreme position and move towards that compromise. A country like Germany always has to do that. A country like France also has to do that. You need to be, and I think a country like Poland, because Poland is one of the big member states, and that carries special responsibilities. You're not only responsible for your own interest, but you're responsible for the European Union as a whole, as a big member state. But no, definitely because of Brexit, our position, our relative weight in the Union is changing.
Minister, you said that the decision has been already taken.
No, it's just an unnecessary remark. But I think it is not planned. It is rather spontaneous reaction of all other players around the table. We know that we are losing Great Britain. We know what does it mean in terms of different coalitions, like trade, internal market, Atlantic agenda, and we know the dynamic and statistics of the voting system. So it's nothing planned. It is natural that the consolidation of the, let's say, northern axis is a matter of fact today in Europe. And it's not only the question of the northern axis in Eurozone, which is a very important aspect of the whole story, but also in a wider sense, because non-Eurozone countries like Poland are deeply involved and interested in vitality of this aspect of the right political balance in Europe. This balance is even more fragile because all positions are maybe the same. The political map of Europe is more or less the same as it was 10 or 15 years ago, but the positions are much more stronger, which means that maybe the balance is almost in the same point, but with a much stronger factors in Rome, in Copenhagen, or The Hague. All positions taking into account, for example, the MFF debate. The composition of the map is the same, but positions much stronger, which means that the compromise will be less available. But we have to defend our political interest and ratio. And this is natural that in many cases, cooperation between Poland and Netherlands in already mentioned aspects is of crucial importance.
Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, the idea of this meeting, lecture and this panel was to show to you that debating about future of Europe can be really a fascinating thing. So our two discussants proved that very well. So I would like all of you to join me in thanking him. So applause, please. Thank you very much, gentlemen.
Proszę Państwa, miłym obowiązkiem gospodarza, ponieważ czas jest nieubłagany, jest podziękowanie za tą kolejną część naszego spotkania. Jestem przekonany, że zarówno wykład pana profesora, za który jeszcze raz dziękujemy, jak też dyskusja panów ministrów, której mogliśmy się przysłuchiwać i za poprowadzenie której bardzo serdecznie dziękuję panu dyrektorowi Dębskiemu, tak naprawdę zrodziła pewnie wiele refleksji, przemyśleń. W związku z tym nasze spotkanie nie kończy się jeszcze. W tej chwili zapraszamy wszystkich Państwa na skromny poczęstunek, ale przede wszystkim jest to możliwość kuluarowych rozmów, dzielenia się właśnie refleksjami, przemyśleniami. Bardzo serdecznie wszystkim Państwu dziękuję za udział w dzisiejszym wykładzie. Dziękuję bardzo.